At an intersection on the road of things that I find absolutely fascinating is this somewhat wacky story of Napoleon and his invasion of Egypt, and potentially the start of modern Egyptology. It is a strange combination of wacky Regency nonsense, epic war campaign, and ancient civilization. This video is going to be coming to you in 3 parts. So number 1 is going to be, why was Napoleon in Egypt to begin with? Number 2, how did the Egyptian campaign go? And then number 3, what effect that campaign had on modern Egyptology. So I think this is kind of a fun story to go over before next time when I'm going to go over Egyptian thought and mythology. And then time after that, we're going to finally get into the history of the Old Kingdom. And so it's a good 3-part series on Egypt. There will be more Egypt later because we also have to do the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. But we're not going to do those yet because that gets us to 2000 BCE, and then we're going to move on to China. So part 1, why did the French invade Egypt? So now when you think of Napoleon in Egypt, you are probably imagining some scene from a specific movie or perhaps just from myth of Napoleon shooting the nose off the Sphinx or his soldiers shooting the nose off. Let's clear up a little defamation on my man Napoleon here. He would not do that. He would not allow his soldiers to do that. The Sphinx lost its nose because the nose is an easy part to lose on any statue. There is a reason so many statues and monuments are missing noses. They knock off pretty easy. So while Napoleon would not do that, he would approve his soldiers with sabers to go and kill all the dogs in Cairo. So don't get it twisted. Napoleon would never shoot a nose off a Sphinx. He would just kill thousands of feral dogs. So quick background on French history. French Revolution is 1789. The execution of King Louis XVI is in 1793. Napoleon is a Corsican artillery officer in the Revolutionary Army. He is part of the campaigns that were fighting post-revolution against Austria, Prussian, Holland, England. Am I missing someone? Austria, Prussia, Holland, Spain, England. So by the late 1790s, thanks in large part to Napoleon, France is pretty much just at war with Britain. France is ruled by a directory of 5 men who are elected in sort of a convoluted way by a few different assemblies, but they are the ones who are running France right now, and they are in a fairly tenuous position with their power. And the idea of going to Egypt was a little out of left field for them. It should not have been the thing that they were probably doing right at that moment, but A, they would like a colony that was potentially very rich, and B, they wanted to stick it to Britain and potentially get some form of military win against them, and C, they needed the very popular Napoleon out of France. They approved the Egyptian campaign. They gave Napoleon 50,000 troops, and off he went. In 1798, young General Napoleon Bonaparte is riding high off the siege of Toulon. In 1793, he has just had a successful invasion and plunder of Italy in 1796. And Napoleon is given a fleet, which he does not know how to use properly because he is an artillery officer and not a sailor. 16,000 sailors to go with it, and then 36,000 land infantry type troops. And to add to that, of what he's bringing with him to Egypt, are 151 scientists, engineers, surveyors, artists, zoologists, savants of all types. He's got some intellectual elites who are coming along to Egypt for various purposes. They're not totally sure why. And a lot of them are students or just daredevils who are willing to take this break in their career and go to parts unknown with Napoleon. They are all, for the most part, atheists, and they are believers in the revolution. And despite what you might think, Napoleon was not foolish enough to directly attempt to invade Britain. Though he potentially did drop some plans for that, they did not do that. They did not decide they needed to go invade Britain. Instead, it was Egypt. Egypt was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, in name. In actuality, it was under the control of the Mamluks, who sent a certain amount of tax back to the Ottomans and then were left alone. The Mamluks are their own complicated history lesson all on their own. So let's just go with this. They were a slave class purchased from the Caucasus area or Eastern Europe, and they were initially brought in to be a military elite that were extremely loyal to the Ottomans. They broke away and then they gained control of Egypt and acted sort of as noblemen within Egypt. They were still a slave class that each successive generation of Mamluks were still slaves purchased from the Caucasus or Eastern Europe. Power for the Mamluks was not given generationally through father to son. There was no primogeniture. It was, you had to be a slave who was raised in the Mamluk way. So Egypt is the gateway from Africa to Asia. It is potentially rich and could provide a lot of natural resources for France if they cared to extract them. So cash crops like sugarcane or indigo. It put France one step closer to India, and there was that potential of building a canal at Suez between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, which would allow for the bypassing of Africa completely when forming trade routes. Egypt also represented a way to challenge Britain in the Mediterranean Sea without actually going to naval warfare with Britain, in which case France would have been helplessly outmatched. There was no way that they were competitive with the British Navy. But Napoleon is not just interested in conquering Egypt and establishing trade. He is also interested in setting up an institute of Egyptology. Partly, I think, to show a certain level of domination over the area. You can't successfully study something in this very rigorous and academic setting if you don't have control over it, or at least that is the presentation that would be given. But it would signal to Britain that France was in control of Egypt, that they were publishing academic papers about it. So the idea was that the Institute of Egyptology was going to write reports and write scientific journals and then send those to the French Institute, which would then disseminate as they pleased throughout Europe. But also Napoleon is a really methodical guy. So he set up road and sewer systems while he was the Emperor of France. They were very effective. And then he's also an honorary member of the scientific division of the French Institute. He was the president of the French Academy of Science, and he was an expert at applied mathematics, which came in especially handy when he was an artillery officer. And pretty much in any battle where cannons were used, Napoleon knew where to put that cannon. So Napoleon is no intellectual slouch. And if anyone, any leaders at that time period was going to set up an institute with some form of academic rigor, it would have been Napoleon. Which leads us to part 2, Napoleon's Campaign. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, and they were there for about 3 years to September, August of 1801. The British, hearing about Napoleon's movements, sent Admiral Nelson out onto the high seas to go look for Napoleon, but he was not found. Napoleon goes to Malta, where he kind of uses it as a staging point, and then from Malta on to Alexandria. At this point, Napoleon has a flotilla of 14 ships, the aforementioned 50,000 troops, and 151 scientists. Savants. Scientists, savants, picky poison. From Alexandria, Napoleon would march his soldiers to Cairo. They were in wool uniforms and they did not bring away to carry water, and they were very short supplied on food. The typical way the French army worked, and this was their downfall in Russia also during that invasion, is that they would steal food from the population kind of as like a tax of French liberation, and that is what they would eat. And that works great if you're invading Italy, which is why Napoleon had such success in Italy. It is not great when you're invading a people that, in Russia's case, are willing to burn everything to the ground before letting you have it. Or in Egypt's case, the population is so widely dispersed and there are these big sand areas that there just isn't anything to steal. If Napoleon had been, and this is kind of like quarterbacking history here, but it probably would have been much wiser for the French fleet to have sailed down the Nile, or just to send some of them down the Nile instead of marching them across the desert. Hundreds of men died either from heat stroke or they committed suicide. Right when he gets in sight of the pyramids at Giza, we have the Battle of the Pyramids, which did not take place right on the pyramids. You could just see the pyramids. So we call it the Battle of the Pyramids. And in this battle, Napoleon faces about 21,000 Mamluks. And with that defeat, the French effectively control northern Egypt, also known as Lower Egypt, because of the way the Nile flows. It's a little confusing. Fun fact, Napoleon, when he sees the pyramids and he's giving his troops a pep talk about, like, we're about to go fight this big old Mamluk army, he says 40 centuries of Egyptian history looks down upon you. And he got the date about right. Like, this is not known at this time. There's no accurate dating of the pyramids, and he got it within 4 centuries. That's the good news. Napoleon is in control. Good news, it depends on whose side you're at. That is Napoleon's good news. He is in control of northern Egypt. The bad news is Nelson finds his fleet. So Nelson decides to attack as night is falling, which is a very unusual tactic to do with sea warfare, because you can't see where you're shooting cannons at. But he is able to destroy Napoleon's fleet. There are no British ships that are lost. It's 200 dead, 700 wounded. And then 11 French warships and 2 frigates are lost. And 1,700 sailors are dead. And another 1,900 to 2,000 are injured. The sea battle was a disastrous result for Napoleon. France could no longer run the Egyptian campaign. The control of Malta was returned to the British, and Napoleon and his men were stranded in Egypt for 3 years thanks to the British control of the Mediterranean. But while all of this was an unmitigated disaster for Napoleon, something that was not a disaster was the research being done by his savants. 151 scientists that Napoleon had brought along, and they formed their institute in Cairo with 3 stated goals. 1, the advancement and propagation of enlightenment in Egypt. 2, to search, study, and publish industrial, historical, and natural phenomenon in Egypt. And 3, to offer its opinion on different questions on which to be consulted by the government. So basically, they were going to research Egyptology, but they were also going to answer any questions or create anything that the army needed them to create or do while they were there. Savants began to work, methodically collecting samples from geological to zoological, and then they began to make maps of Alexandria, Cairo, Rosetta, and Egypt as a whole. To their detriment, most of their equipment had been destroyed in the Battle of Aboukir Bay. The French were thankfully able to fabricate a great deal, specifically thanks to this fellow Nicolas Jacques Conté, who was an amazing asset to the savants. He installed and oversaw a small village of workshops where he fabricated everything from gunpowder to cloth, paint, glass instruments, and using only indigenous materials, he created machines, including a printing press, a coin press, geometry machines, engineering tools, and even trumpets. Conté was the most significant reason why the French army did not fall apart while they were in Egypt and stranded. And he was also responsible for creating tools that allowed any research to be properly done by the savants. A point of intrigue for the French was whether or not they would be able to construct a canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. This was most likely going to be the case at a little port village called Suez. Napoleon set his engineering savants at attempting to find how this would happen and whether or not it could happen. But they failed spectacularly. Upon surveying the region, the French decided that connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea would result in the Nile inundating Egypt with salt water. By the time this misconception was resolved in 1809, Napoleon was already emperor and he didn't really care about digging a ditch in Egypt. But despite the initial failure, the engineers did find one very important thing: a medium-sized pink rock that would unlock the secrets of Egypt. Discovered in Rosetta in 1999, the French were digging along a wall trying to reinforce an old Crusader fort on the west bank of the Nile, and an engineer named Pierre-François Xavier Bouchard noticed the stone, and its value was immediately obvious to everyone. Napoleon returned to France in August of 1799. He gained control of the fracturing directory and became the first consul out of 3. Eventually, he would become the Emperor of France in 1804, assuming absolute control. It was not until August of 1801 that our savants were allowed to leave Egypt when the French surrendered to the British, who had begun a bombardment. General Menu was willing to give up all of the savants' work, which the British would have happily taken, but the savants negotiated that they should be allowed to keep their research and their notes, arguing, I think, very fairly that no one else was going to be able to effectively interpret their notes anyways, so it would just kind of be wasted space for the British. What the British did take, though, was the Rosetta Stone, and Manu was forced to surrender the rock itself. A pseudo-race began between the French scholars and the British to see who would crack hieroglyphs first. Thankfully, the French had inked the entire stone, which is why it looks black, and taken prints. It would be the French who won with the help of Jean-Francois Champollion, how's my French, who beat Thomas Young of England in 1822. The stone itself was donated to the British Museum in 1802 by King George III and is located there today in room 4. Part 3, what impact did Napoleon have on Egyptology? At the time of Napoleon, hieroglyphs were a dead language. Due to Egypt being occupied first by the Greeks and then by the Romans, the language became dead about 1,000 years previously. Egyptian history was mostly unknown, and while one could see the beautiful writing on the stelas and the tombs, no one could read them. And nothing was kept in a museum, and most of what was found and taken out of Egypt was relegated to curiosity cabinets. Hieroglyphs themselves were assumed to be ideographic, not alphabetic, so people were assuming that they weren't phonetic at all. Hieroglyphic script can be ideographic, but it also can be phonetic. It really just depends on the context and also how much room the writer has. Despite the many failures of his campaign, it still gave birth to modern Egyptology. Scientists published 10 volumes full of drawings and illustrations, and these volumes would begin an Egyptian fad that would take over Europe. Napoleon had instructed his team to copy the hieroglyphs exactly. This would turn out to be a huge boon to the archaeological community. Translations with the help of the Rosetta Stone were finally able to occur, and Europeans could stay home and just do it based on the drawings from the French savants. The Rosetta Stone had 3 scripts inscribed upon it, but only 2 languages. The hieroglyphic script and Demotic script were both written forms of ancient Egyptian. The other language was Greek. The key to cracking the Rosetta Stone was Coptic, an ancient form of Egyptian from the Coptic Christians who spelled out their language in Greek alphabet. So it was instrumental for bridging the gap between the ancient scripts. And interestingly, the reason why Coptic is in Greek is because when the Christian missionaries originally came, they said, you can't keep writing the book of the words of God in hieroglyphs or Demotic, you need to write them in Greek. And so their whole language got transcribed. So it is still, Coptic is still to this day a form of ancient Egyptian that is still spoken. With the decipherment of hieroglyphs, those pyramid walls could be read, and there was a reason to excavate. And now we know a great deal about Egyptian history. We have king's lists, papyruses, and wonderful architecture. Even though Egypt is a mysterious place, even today, we know so much of what was lost for a millennia. On a negative side, though, the fad of Egypt led to what has been called the rape of the Nile. Europeans wanted to own real Egyptian artifacts, and it may have happened without Napoleon's campaign, but the wholesale plunder of Egypt began in earnest a few years after the savants left. The first post-Napoleonic French and British consulate in Egypt were enthusiastic participants in this new antiquities trade, and by the 1820s, the Nile Valley was buzzing with digs operating in the major sites from Giza to Luxor to Aswan. The goal was a race between empires to find and claim as many objects as possible to bring back to Europe, and how well they treated these artifacts varied wildly. Many a tomb or scientific cache was handled poorly and without scientific methodology. Many of these acquisitions now sit in Berlin, Paris, New York, or London. At the time, the Egyptians themselves were not concerned with historical preservation. Villagers aided in the plunder. But to be kept in mind, these Muslim and Coptic peasants were desperately poor and largely uneducated. If Europeans wanted to pay for antiquities, they could sorely use the money. Their perceptions of the Egyptian past were often based around superstition, and so no real value was ascribed to the artifacts. Appeals began to be made to stop the destruction and extraction of Egypt's antiquities, and over time, Egypt was able to control what left the country and what remained to be displayed in museums within Egypt, or stayed in their original locations to be viewed and preserved based on the discretion of the government and archaeologists seeking to maintain the sites. All of this because Napoleon brought scientists on his invasion of Egypt. And I honestly believe this is one of the most important things that Napoleon has ever done. And that is out of a very long list of contributions that Napoleon has made to history. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you join me next time to go over Egyptian thought and mythology. Subscribe and like if you would like to see more.